Okay, let's look at an idea that's not natural selection, but might be really closely connected to it and may provide some evidence that natural selection really is an important mechanism for producing change. So, not all selection is natural. Charles Darwin, you've heard of him, in his book Origin of Species, said, um, there's lots of kinds of pigeons and lots of kinds of cats, lots of kinds of dogs, and in the case of the slide, lots of kinds of cattle. Where did these cattle come from? Were these cattle found in nature this way? No, humans produced them. And Darwin suggested this was actually an example of artificial selection, where a human decides, which bull mates with which cow to produce offspring is not natural, as in the bull and the cow did not decide to do that. Humans decided which organisms were going to mate. Humans decided that this bull had a desirable trait, this cow had a desirable trait, and if I mate them and produce offspring, perhaps the offspring are going to have some of these combinations of desirable traits as well. So Darwin cited the idea that if you look around already, we have lots of variation, but this variation was caused by not natural selection, but by artificial selection. As you look at the kinds of dogs, dogs range in all types, going from dachshunds to schnauzers to boxers to Dalmatians, lots of different kinds of dogs. These dogs did not exist in nature. They were produced through artificial selection or selective breeding when humans decided which male and which female would mate. How does it work? The original source, the original genetic source, if you will, of all dogs, Great Danes, Chihuahuas, and Beagles, was the gray wolf. It's an ancestor to all modern dogs. By looking at variation in gray wolf populations, maybe you had some gray wolves that had more hair or had spots versus other gray wolves that did not have those traits. When those gray wolves mated with each other, they produced variation. They produced certain traits. Well, imagine we go back a couple thousand years ago, and humans paid more attention to variations of different kinds of animals. They may have chosen at a certain point to breed a certain kind of cow and a certain kind of bull, or a certain kind of dog with another certain kind of dog, and they get something, let's pretend something like a beagle. Well, if they breed beagles with other beagles, they will get those same traits. In other words, humans were controlling the outcome of these matings in terms of trying to achieve certain kinds of variation. This is not as true in animals. The wild mustard plant, Brassica, that's the genus, Brassica has been modified through artificial selection by controlling which plants pollinate which plants to produce a variety of plants, as you see here. When you talk about broccoli or cabbage or cauliflower, this is all modified from the original wild mustard plant line. In other words, before humans began to do this, there were no kales or broccolis or Brussels sprouts. But through selective breeding, which is another term for artificial selection, humans controlled which organisms mated with which, and as you can see from an original source plant, there's a lot of variety possible. Looking here briefly at this very colorful picture of beans and peppers and corn, lots of variation has been able to be incorporated because of artificial selection. So, does artificial selection support the idea that natural selection can produce diversity in nature? The simple answer, yes. If you imagine for a second that the same thing that produces dog breeds or cattle breeds or different kinds of mustard plants is the same thing that happens in nature. It's simply in nature, who gets to mate with whom is determined by who survives, versus with humans, it is which bull gets to mate with which cow. It actually, you can see the connection. By the mating process, you produce variation. The only principal difference between artificial selection and natural selection is who is controlling it. Artificial selection is controlled by humans. Natural selection is controlled by who survives and reproduces the best. So Darwin used artificial selection as a key piece of evidence to suggest, with enough time, variations possible. What artificial selection does is it compresses the time so that you end up with lots of variation in a short period of time. Natural selection does the same thing, if you will, over a long period of time. So, do understand artificial selection was cited by Darwin as an important piece of supporting evidence for his idea of natural selection. Thanks.